I never imagined I would come to resent my own family. Even as a child, I believed home was a place of warmth and acceptance, a safe harbor from the chaos of the outside world. Yet the moment my sister was born with severe autism, something inside our house shifted. Suddenly, all the light and attention that once felt evenly distributed shone solely on her. At first, I was just a curious 6-year-old who adored the idea of being a big sibling. I remember pressing my ear against the door of my parents' room, listening for signs of the baby moving or crying, excited by the thought that I would get to teach her how to play tag or color pictures of cartoon characters. In my tiny heart, I imagined a lifetime of shared stories and laughter, every day brightened by the presence of a new best friend. But the fairy tale dream I had conjured never became real. As the days turned into months and then years, my parents' energy revolved around coping with my sister's challenges. She needed constant attention, specialized routines, and more patience than any of us knew we were capable of giving. Before I even realized what was happening, I had slid into the background. Certain decisions, like moving me into the basement so she could take my old room, felt abrupt and unsettling. One morning, I was still upstairs, comfortable in my bed with the sunlight gently sneaking through the curtains, and by that evening I found myself trudging down into a dim, chilly basement space that smelled of dust and stale air. The contrast was jarring. It was as if I no longer had a rightful place in my own home, and that sense of displacement planted the first seed of resentment in me. You might think the story would end there, with a few bruised feelings and some awkward adjustments, but what unfolded next tore at our family's foundations, far more than I could have imagined. The emotional winds were only beginning to stir, and soon, a storm would come that nobody in our home was prepared to face. The next few years were like watching a slow transformation in the mirror. I tried to stay understanding, telling myself that my sister needed all this attention because of her condition, and that my parents were simply exhausted. Yet, a subtle hurt gnawed at me every time I felt overlooked or pushed aside. My sister would accidentally break my toys, rip pages out of my favorite books, and even spoil cherished art projects I poured my heart into. Still, whenever I voiced my frustration, the response from my parents never changed. "She doesn't understand. You're older. You have to be more patient." It wasn't that I expected them to punish her, but I longed for some recognition that I was hurting too. Eventually, the question that shadowed my thoughts became, do I matter at all? It felt dramatic even to me, but it was a genuine reflection of how invisible I'd begun to feel. At school, I found solace in my studies and after-class activities, because at least there I could carve out an identity that wasn't overshadowed by my sister's needs. School allowed me to be someone more than just the sibling of a special needs child. I joined clubs, tried out for sports, and volunteered for community projects. Some of those activities I loved, others I merely tolerated, but they all shared one thing in common. They gave me a sense of belonging, but the comfort of school could only stretch so far. Once the final bell rang, I returned home to the basement, to an environment that felt colder with every passing day. And as my sense of invisibility grew, my desperation for acknowledgement was about to push me to the brink of a dramatic confrontation I never saw coming. One of the first major cracks in my composure happened with the MacBook the school had loaned me for a special project. I had earned it through consistent good grades and a proposal for a computer-based science fair entry. That laptop symbolized a flicker of hope, something that was exclusively mine, and in a household where almost nothing belonged to me anymore, it was a big deal. I handled it with extreme care. I'd spend evenings in the basement, typing away on new ideas for the science fair, reading up on astrophysics, or trying to code simple programs for class. Having that laptop was like having my own little window to the world. Then it got destroyed. I came home one day to find its screen smashed, the keys pulled off, the hinges practically dangling. My sister must have gotten her hands on it and treated it like a toy. As I stared at the wreckage, I felt tears sting my eyes. I immediately sought out my parents, but all they did was shrug, telling me I should have kept it somewhere safer. Nobody seemed outraged on my behalf. If anything, they were almost dismissive. The school was furious with me for being so careless, and I felt mortified. The sense of betrayal cut deep. I had guarded that laptop like it was a precious gem, and somehow I was still left carrying the blame. I wish I could say it was just that one incident, a singular heartbreak that we all somehow worked through. But the MacBook disaster was like setting off a chain reaction, a preview of more accusations, more resentments, and more moments that would break my spirit again and again. In fact, the worst was still to come. My life became a carefully orchestrated balancing act, one where my sister's unpredictability dominated every decision. Being a teen, I craved normal experiences, like going to a new movie premiere with friends or simply hanging out without my phone buzzing every few minutes. However, in my household, responsibilities were doled out like duties in a crisis center. Whenever my sister had an episode or needed assistance, I was expected to drop everything and rush home. Sometimes, all I wanted was just 2 hours of peace in a movie theater, losing myself in a fictional world where I didn't have to be the older sibling, the caretaker, or the stand-in nurse. One weekend, I worked up the nerve to do exactly that. The new Spider-Man was out, and my friend Jake was hyped about it for weeks. His excitement was contagious, and I caught myself smiling at the thought of cheering along in a packed cinema. For once, I decided to switch off my phone during the screening, hoping to snatch just that short interval of freedom. But as soon as I powered my phone back on, I found multiple missed calls and texts from my parents. Panic surged through me, and I hurried to call them, only to be greeted with fury. They wanted to know where I'd been, telling me they had needed my help with my sister an hour ago. No explanation I gave could stem the wave of anger. By the time I raced home, my mother was on the verge of tears, and my father's words lashed at me with the intensity of a thunderstorm. I thought this might be the moment they would realize how much they were asking of me. I believed they might see that I was just a young person aching for some semblance of autonomy. But instead of loosening the chains, they tightened them further. What came next was a punishment that would not only ground me, but also anchor me in an ever-expanding circle of guilt and resentment. They barred me from seeing friends for a month, took away any privileges I had left, and insisted I was acting selfishly. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent years putting my sister first, rearranging my life around her needs, and missing countless social events. Now, the single time I chose to do something solely for myself, I was labeled irresponsible and unreliable. My bedroom in the basement felt more like a holding cell than a personal space. I'd stare at the concrete walls in the dim light and wonder if this was truly all my life had in store for me. Sometimes I'd catch myself resenting my sister for her condition, but then a wave of guilt would crash over me. It wasn't her fault she had special needs. Logically, I knew that. She didn't ask to be born this way, and she certainly didn't wish for me to feel so constrained. Yet, there were moments when my anger sizzled so intensely that I wanted to scream. I wondered if my parents even realized how trapped and lonely I felt. Being 18, on the cusp of adulthood, but feeling like my life was stolen before it even had a chance to begin, was a heavier burden than I knew how to carry. But the weight of constant caretaking and guilt wasn't the only thing piling up. I was about to experience an even bigger heartbreak, a moment when my own achievements would go unnoticed, and it would become painfully clear that in my parents' eyes, my worth existed mainly in how I served my sister's needs. High school, for all its social drama and academic pressure, had moments that felt almost magical. I had been selected to give a speech at a school event, a rare acknowledgement of my hard work and perseverance. For weeks, I poured every spare second into perfecting that speech. I wanted it to be powerful, a reflection of all I'd learned through adversity. My teachers believed in me. My classmates seemed supportive, and for once, I felt a glimmer of pride. For once, something in my life felt centered around my accomplishments rather than my sister's circumstances. My parents promised to be there. They even told me they were proud of me for working so hard, and I took comfort in that, imagining them in the front row, smiling and cheering me on. Then, on the night of the event, I scanned the audience, heart pounding, adrenaline rushing. The principal introduced me, but neither mom nor dad was there. Desperately, I kept hoping they would slip in late, but their seats remained empty until the end. Later, I learned something had happened at home with my sister, some meltdown or emergency. They'd stayed behind to handle it, apparently forgetting to even text me. A part of me understood she needed them, but another part of me broke that evening. It wasn't just the humiliation of standing at the podium alone, or the tears I fought back during the entire speech. It was the deafening echo of the repeated message, My dreams, my milestones, my life, these things came second. Yet, I had no idea just how deep that mindset ran for my parents, nor the lengths they would go to maintain it. Something far worse lurked on the horizon, a secret I had yet to uncover. Fast forward a few weeks, and we had a rare calm moment in the house. My dad casually asked me to join him at the kitchen table, brochures for various colleges spread out in front of him. For a second, my heart soared. Maybe we were finally going to talk about my future like normal families do. Maybe they had realized I deserved the chance to explore the world beyond our four walls. We began discussing majors, potential campuses, and scholarship opportunities. My excitement grew with each question my dad asked, each moment of genuine interest he showed in my aspirations. Then, in an offhand remark, he half-joked that I should pick a lucrative major, so I'd be able to financially support my sister once my parents were gone. He smirked, as though it was a benign piece of paternal advice. But in that instant, something inside me snapped. All the years of pent-up frustration, anger, and sorrow erupted like a volcano. I can still remember the stunned look on my dad's face as I shouted through tears about how unfair it was that my entire life was expected to revolve around my sister. I accused him and my mother of seeing me not as an individual with dreams and rights, but as a convenient caretaker for the future. My voice shook as I hurled every painful memory at him. You might think that confrontation led to a heartfelt discussion or an overdue apology. But let me tell you, what happened next only confirmed my fears in ways I hadn't dared to imagine. My dad's stone-cold response and my mother's echoing silence marked the beginning of a rupture too large to mend with simple words. My parents stared at me, unblinking, as though I were speaking a foreign language they'd never heard. I remember the moment so clearly. My father's lips parted as though he might try to console me, but no words came out. My mother simply shook her head, repeating that I was overreacting. The hollowness in their eyes stung me more deeply than any harsh remark could. I expected anger or defensive arguments, but what I got was something colder, more dispassionate, as though my meltdown was a nuisance they wished would just go away. In the aftermath of that explosive confrontation, I locked myself in my room for hours, tears staining my cheeks, waiting for them to knock on the door and show some concern. But the house remained silent. No footsteps approached. No gentle voice asked if I was okay. It felt as if my pain was an inconvenience, like they were so drained from years of dealing with my sister's condition that they had nothing left to offer me. That night, I realized I was utterly alone in this house, that my pleas and tears would bounce off the walls, never truly reaching my parents' hearts. And yet, even in that loneliness, my story was about to take a turn. I thought I knew everything there was to know about how my parents handled my sister's condition, but the days ahead would reveal secrets that would shake me to my core. When the truth finally came to light, it would set off a chain of events that would change my life forever. I summoned the courage to leave. After days of numb silence and nights spent anxiously picturing every possible outcome, I decided I couldn't stay in that suffocating environment. My grandfather was my only beacon of hope. He was the one person who ever truly listened to me. On an evening when my parents seemed too busy or too uninterested to notice, I packed a small bag of essentials and quietly walked out. My heart pounded with each step away from the house, but a strange sense of relief washed over me with every footfall on the driveway. Grandpa lived a few miles away, in a smaller home that was old, but comfortably lived in. When I arrived, he opened the door without a single word of reproach. He simply let me inside, handed me a blanket, and told me to settle in. Only after I calmed down did we speak. I poured out everything, the stress, the heartbreak, the suppressed anger, the twisted sense of duty that had replaced my own identity. He listened, face etched with disbelief and sorrow. It was as though he'd had no clue how deeply my parents' priorities had skewed. Little did I know, that night was the start of a much larger unraveling. Grandpa, horrified by what I told him, began asking his questions, and as he dug deeper, I realized that the story of my sister's care was riddled with deceit. Uncovering the truth would only add fuel to the fire that was about to engulf my relationship with my parents. As I settled into my grandfather's spare bedroom, a cozy space filled with old books and embroidered quilts, I felt a sense of calm I hadn't experienced in years. No longer did I have to sleep in a cold basement that echoed with the footsteps above. No longer did I dread the next moment my phone would ring, demanding I rush home for an emergency. Yet the silence also made space for a new kind of anxiety. Would my parents come after me? Would they demand I return? Or would they care at all? The next morning, Grandpa decided to give my parents a call. I expected him to coax me back home, urging me to reconcile. Instead, he had a long, heated conversation that left him white-faced with anger. I picked up snippets. Something about a promised caregiver that never existed, about funds from relatives that were supposed to pay for professional help but were suspiciously unaccounted for. From his side of the conversation, I gathered that my parents had been telling extended family members they hired outside help to alleviate the strain of caring for my sister. But from what I had seen, no such professional had ever walked through our door. It became terrifyingly clear that my parents were not just neglecting me emotionally. They had woven a tapestry of lies that deceived countless people. And with Grandpa determined to get to the bottom of it, I braced myself for the ultimate showdown, unsure whether we would walk away from this with any semblance of familial unity left intact. Over the next week, phone calls poured in from aunts, uncles, and cousins. Each conversation sounded more outraged than the last. People I barely heard from suddenly wanted every detail. They kept apologizing, telling me they had no idea my parents were funneling money meant for a caregiver into something else. It turned out my parents were collecting monthly contributions from the family, who believed the funds were paying for specialized help. That revelation left me reeling. We were always told finances were tight because of my sister's condition. Now, I wondered if the repeated denial of my personal needs, from the destroyed laptop to missing my speech, was partially fueled by the fact that they had spent resources on other things, lying to the entire family. In some ways, hearing these stories validated my years of feeling overlooked. The rest of the family was furious, not just on my behalf, but also for being misled. Grandpa insisted that until matters were sorted, I should stay with him. He worried for my well-being, convinced that my parents had placed an unhealthy burden on my shoulders for far too long. Day by day, my heartbreak slowly mixed with a flicker of hope that maybe I could still salvage parts of my future. But even amid the outpouring of family support, I felt a dread creeping into my chest. If my parents had lied about a professional caregiver, what else could they have been hiding? And when they finally confronted me and Grandpa face to face, would there be any chance of reconciliation, or would it be a final, irrevocable severing of ties? A few days later, my parents requested a meeting. Whether it was spurred by shame, anger, or a desire to set the record straight, I didn't know. Grandpa and I agreed to it, but only on the condition that he would stay by my side the entire time. He had become my shield, the father figure I desperately needed, and I leaned on his steady presence to face whatever revelations might come. The evening of the showdown, we all gathered in Grandpa's living room. My father looked uncomfortable, his posture rigid, and my mother's eyes darted around as though searching for an escape. Instead of apologies, they delivered confessions that left me speechless. They admitted to using the family's contributions for general household expenses and my sister's therapies, except it turned out those therapies weren't provided by a licensed caregiver. They had systematically deceived people to avoid criticism or pity. When I challenged them, pointing out how they'd also neglected my emotional needs and dumped caretaker responsibilities on me, they grew defensive. My mother claimed that was simply my role in the family, and my father said, with unsettling directness, that I'd been born to care for my sister, as if my entire existence had no purpose beyond that. I could feel Grandpa seething beside me. My own shock turned into outrage as tears threatened to spill down my cheeks. I thought hearing their side of the story might soften my anger, but it only intensified my sense of betrayal. And with that betrayal came the stark realization that our family bond was hanging by a thread, one tug away from snapping beyond repair. The conversation escalated from tense to volatile. Grandpa demanded explanations for the missing funds and the blatant lies told to relatives. My mother claimed it was all done to ensure the best care for my sister, but the evidence of any best care was glaringly absent. My father tried to deflect, accusing Grandpa of meddling in affairs he didn't understand, insisting this was all blown out of proportion. The verbal sparring spiraled, culminating in the accusation that I was ungrateful for everything they'd done for me, as though providing food and shelter while systematically undermining my autonomy constituted some extraordinary favor. I couldn't hold back. Every slight, every broken promise, every moment of invisibility gushed out like a torrent I'd kept pent up for too long. I told them how it felt to watch my prized laptop get destroyed without a shred of support, how humiliating it was to stand alone at my speech, how devastating it felt to be scolded for simply trying to see a movie, and how it shattered my soul to hear I was basically nothing more than a lifelong caretaker for my sister. My voice cracked under the weight of those words, but I said them all. By the time I finished, the living room was so silent, I could hear the faint ticking of the wall clock. In that silence, a part of me dared to hope they would finally see the damage they'd inflicted, that maybe regret or remorse would cross their faces. But if I'd learned anything by then, it was that sometimes even the truth wasn't enough to bridge a broken family. I was bracing for their response, completely unaware that the next words out of my father's mouth would be the final blow that made any reconciliation impossible. He barely glanced at me. Instead, he addressed Grandpa, insisting he had no right to interfere with how they raised their children. My father's expression was cold, almost contemptuous, as he repeated that caring for my sister was my responsibility, not something up for debate or negotiation. Even in the face of everything I just revealed about my pain, he refused to budge an inch. My mother looked down, fiddling with the hem of her shirt, a complicated mix of shame and stubbornness etched on her face. She said nothing that resembled an apology, nor any sign of empathy. Grandpa's anger became palpable, his voice trembling as he explained how I deserved a chance at my own life, how no child should bear the weight of full-time caregiver. But my parents wouldn't hear it. They insisted I was the only one who could understand and love my sister enough to manage her unique needs. My father even invoked guilt, asking if I wanted my sister to be thrown into some institution after they were gone. The emotional manipulation was undeniable, and tears pricked my eyes anew. But for the first time, I felt a surge of defiance overshadow my guilt. That was when I realized there was no turning back. The sense of liberation that flickered inside me sprang from the knowledge that I couldn't allow myself to be coerced any longer. I thought leaving home was the hardest step. But discovering my parents' unwavering determination to lock me into a role I never chose proved that the real challenge was just beginning. After that disastrous meeting, it was clear I couldn't go back. Grandpa supported my decision, and so did many of my aunts, uncles, and cousins. Some even offered to help pay for any legal advice I might need, suggesting that if my parents tried to force me home, I had rights they couldn't override. The idea of it becoming a legal battle made my stomach churn, but I felt a spark of comfort knowing I had a safety net of extended family who genuinely cared. I continued sleeping on Grandpa's couch, though he told me I could move into his guest room permanently if I wanted. I still wrestled with heartbreak. After all, these were my parents. There was a deep, primal part of me that yearned for their love, approval, and understanding. But each day that passed, each hour that they didn't call to check on me or see how I was doing, solidified my resolve. In my darkest moments, I questioned if I was heartless. Could I abandon my sister? But then I would recall all the times I had tried to be there for her and how my parents had exploited that willingness until my own spirit began to crack. I thought I had uncovered every secret, faced every painful truth. Yet, the tension in the air indicated there was more lying beneath the surface. If my parents had lied about the caregiver, had they also hidden other truths about my sister's condition, her finances, or my own future prospects? I was about to find out that even in heartbreak, new revelations can still strike like lightning. One late afternoon, Grandpa and I were sorting through some old documents in his study. He wanted to ensure I had the proper identification, like my birth certificate and social security card, so I could apply for colleges on my own terms. Among the worn folders and yellowed papers, we stumbled across something unexpected, a life insurance policy my parents had taken out, naming me as the backup beneficiary, but with a caveat. It stipulated that any funds I received were to be used for my sister's ongoing care. The policy also contained a note about special trust accounts, though Grandpa had never heard my parents mention any of this. Seeing my name tied to a future that revolved around my sister's care sent a chill through me. It wasn't just an offhand joke about majoring in something lucrative anymore. This was a formal document, proof that my parents were planning my adulthood around my sister's needs without my knowledge. It felt like stepping on a landmine. Every piece of evidence confirmed a pattern. In their minds, my fate had been sealed since the day I was born. The shock coursed through my veins as I realized how meticulously they had orchestrated my destiny. And with every page we turned, I braced myself for more evidence that would confirm the worst, that I was never meant to live a life of my own. My parents had apparently been planning for me to inherit their burden, no matter what I wanted. I spent that evening debating with Grandpa about whether to confront my parents again. A part of me wanted to fling the documents in their faces, demand answers, and force them to see how twisted it all was. Another part of me felt nothing but exhaustion. Our last meeting had ended in disaster, and the idea of enduring another barrage of emotional manipulation made me want to collapse on the spot. The repeated message that I was born to do this sank deeper into my psyche, stirring up a dangerous mix of rage and despair. Grandpa recommended we consult with my uncle, who had some experience with legal matters. When we did, the conversation was eye-opening. My uncle explained that, technically, my parents could set up any number of policies, but legally, I wasn't bound to them unless I consented. However, disentangling myself might require official action once I turned 18, which was right around the corner. He reassured me that no one could force me into a life I didn't want, no matter how they manipulated paperwork. That glimmer of hope felt like a lifeline in a raging sea of confusion. Yet, hope can be a fragile thing when it battles against a lifetime of familial expectation. Even as my uncle spelled out my legal rights, a nagging fear took root. Would I have to sever ties completely to be free? I sensed that another confrontation was inevitable, and if my parents wouldn't see reason, I might have to turn my back on them for good. While I was grappling with these legal complexities, my extended family quietly rallied behind me. They started inviting me to their homes for dinner, texting me to check how I was doing, and making sure I never felt alone. My aunt, who had been giving money to my parents under the false impression it was for professional care, was especially furious. She apologized profusely for not realizing something was off sooner. She told me she'd redirect those funds directly into a college savings account for me, ensuring that if I wanted to pursue higher education, I wouldn't be financially shackled by my parents' decisions. In each conversation with relatives, more shocking tidbits surfaced. My parents had spun stories about how I was so devoted to my sister, how I'd volunteered to stay home, or how I turned down scholarships because I couldn't bear to leave my sister behind. It was infuriating. The truth was that I had never declined any scholarships. The truth was that I longed for independence, but was never permitted to have it. Realizing how many lies they'd told about me to maintain their facade of a united family stung in ways I couldn't fully articulate. However, their carefully crafted illusion was cracking, and with each phone call from a concerned relative, I felt the walls caging me start to crumble. But as those walls fell, I began to realize that my next step, fully separating my life from my parents, was both liberating and terrifying. A leap I couldn't take without risking the final collapse of our already fragile relationship. I tried to take comfort in small joys during that uncertain time. Grandpa's house, though modest, felt like a palace compared to the basement I once called home. We'd watch old Western movies together in the evenings, and he would share stories of his youth, how he once saved every penny to travel across the country. There was a worldliness to him that hinted at the adventures I might have, if only I freed myself from the shadow of my parents. Occasionally, we'd go out for a simple meal at the local diner, where I could laugh without fear of my phone buzzing. It was a strange new existence, a taste of normalcy I hadn't realized I was starving for. Yet guilt still gnawed at me. My sister, innocent of her condition, remained with my parents, likely unaware of the family rift that had erupted. I questioned whether I was abandoning her. On days when I felt particularly torn, Grandpa would sit me down, reminding me that it wasn't my sister's fault, and it certainly wasn't mine either. The blame, he insisted, lay squarely with the parents who refused to accept help and forced a child to shoulder responsibilities meant for trained professionals or themselves. These conversations were a temporary balm, but the guilt had deep roots. Despite the renewed sense of freedom, I knew I could never fully escape the sorrow of leaving my sister behind. And in the midst of grappling with these emotions, a new confrontation loomed closer, as my parents were determined to reel me back under their control. Finally, the day of the second meeting arrived. My parents wanted another discussion, this time apparently to address the swirling accusations from the extended family. Grandpa insisted he and my uncle be present as well, and they agreed. We gathered at my uncle's house, a neutral territory, with enough space for everyone to talk without the tension of being on home turf. I walked in with my heart pounding, palms sweaty, unsure whether this would be an act of contrition or yet another high-pressure tactic to get me back in line. My father cleared his throat and jumped right to the point. He acknowledged certain misunderstandings, but claimed everything they'd done was in my sister's best interest. My mother echoed the sentiment, adding that they never intended to hurt me, but that family must make sacrifices. I waited for an apology that never came. Instead, they questioned why I had involved the rest of the family at all, implying I'd betrayed them by exposing private matters. Their anger at me was palpable, overshadowing any sign of remorse. They didn't even deny the caretaker lie. They just rationalized it as a way to avoid judgmental relatives. If I had been hoping for a heartfelt, tearful reunion, what I got was a stark reminder of who they were and how deeply they believed they were in the right. But even so, my father was about to drop a detail that would shatter the last vestiges of sympathy I held onto, showing me just how far they were willing to go in forcing my hand. He stated plainly that they had every intention of adding clauses to their will, specifying that I would be in charge of my sister's welfare indefinitely. When Grandpa and my uncle questioned this plan, my father grew defensive, saying that was how it had to be. I could hardly breathe. After everything, the arguments, the revelations, the emotional pleas, they were still intent on tethering me to my sister's needs for the rest of my life, with no regard for my personal goals or mental health. At that, I finally spoke up, telling them that if they forced this upon me, I would have no choice but to fully separate myself, both legally and emotionally. I explained how it wasn't that I didn't love my sister, but that being cast in a role I never consented to for the entirety of my life was cruel and unacceptable. Instead of empathy, I got accusations of selfishness and betrayal. My father's words still echo in my mind. "You were meant for this. Stop pretending otherwise." That sentence felt like a punch in the gut, a final blow to any lingering hope I had for reconciliation. In that moment, I knew, if I wanted a real life, free from the constraints they'd tried to impose, I had to walk away. My heart felt like it was splitting in two, but the clock was ticking, and I had to choose. I stormed out of my uncle's house, tears blurring my vision as I heard Grandpa and my uncle raising their voices behind me, still trying to reason with my parents. The fresh air hit me like a slap, and I gasped in shaky breaths, feeling a mixture of fury and devastation. My phone vibrated in my pocket, and for a moment I thought it might be my mother, calling to finally say something meaningful, something that would anchor me back into her love. But it wasn't. It was a text from an aunt, asking if I was okay because she'd heard how badly the meeting was going. I replied with a quick reassurance, although I wasn't even sure what I felt anymore beyond raw betrayal. Grandpa and my uncle joined me outside soon after, both looking somber. Grandpa placed a comforting hand on my shoulder, and we silently got into his car, driving away from the scene that had just severed my last thread of loyalty. I peered out the window, recalling every moment of my childhood, the times I'd sat in the basement, hoping someone would notice me, or the fleeting instances I cherished, like birthdays or small praises. All of it was overshadowed now by the glaring truth that my parents saw me more as an extension of my sister's care plan than as an individual. Sometimes in life, you can almost pinpoint the second your heart hardens to protect itself. That drive away from my uncle's house was that second for me. I realized I wasn't just closing a chapter, I was burning the entire book, uncertain if I'd ever look back without feeling heartbreak. But as it often happens, endings can be beginnings in disguise. Back at Grandpa's, we all gathered around the kitchen table. My aunt, uncle, and cousins who lived nearby joined us. The mood was subdued, but also charged with collective determination. They told me they admired my courage in standing up for myself, and that no matter what, they wouldn't let my parents pull me back into that toxic dynamic. Words of encouragement floated around, how I was on the brink of adulthood, how I had a right to discover my own passions, how I shouldn't be shackled by guilt that wasn't mine to carry. We discussed practical steps, too, finishing my last year of high school from Grandpa's address, applying to out-of-state colleges so I could have a fresh start, and perhaps even considering therapy to process the trauma of growing up feeling invisible. There was no magic wand to erase the sorrow, but for the first time, I wasn't alone in navigating it. Surrounded by family who genuinely cared about my well-being, I felt my shoulders relax, like I'd been bracing for impact for so long that I'd forgotten what it was like to breathe freely. Yet, even amidst the warmth of their support, a silent question loomed. What of my sister? Was it truly okay to leave her in that environment, especially if my parents continued their pattern of lies and neglect? That question haunted me, threatening to erode the fragile peace I was building, and in the nights that followed, I found myself wrestling with the line between my right to freedom and my sister's unknowing dependence. Despite my parents' refusal to acknowledge their wrongdoing, they weren't entirely silent after that meeting. My phone occasionally lit up with texts from my father, each one laced with a new layer of guilt-tripping. He'd say things like, "Your sister asked about you today," or "We can't believe you turned your back on us." My mother's messages took a similar tone, though softer in approach, emphasizing how lost they were without my help. None of them, however, contained the words, "I'm sorry," or "We understand." It was always about how my leaving impacted them, never about how staying had been destroying me. I wrestled with each message, feeling pangs of sorrow for my sister, but also remembering the countless times I had swallowed my own needs. Eventually, I stopped replying. It was too emotionally draining, and I decided I needed space to heal, to form a new identity that wasn't solely defined by someone else's expectations. Grandpa supported this decision wholeheartedly, reminding me that continuing to engage on their terms only pulled me back into old patterns. But cutting off communication can be a double-edged sword. On one hand, I felt relief, like I was finally taking back some control. On the other, a growing sense of finality set in, each day without contact further fracturing the link between me and my parents. I wondered if we'd reached a point of no return, if all these scars were simply too deep to mend. Life with Grandpa took on a steady rhythm. I enrolled at the local high school near his neighborhood, grateful for the relative anonymity. My uncle helped me gather the necessary documentation to prove my new residence, and soon enough, I was walking a different set of hallways, meeting new teachers and classmates who didn't know my past. It felt surreal to have a clean slate, to tell people about myself without the label "sister of a severely autistic child" hovering over every conversation. Of course, that was still a part of my life story, but here, I got to define what I shared and when. Academically, I thrived. Without constant interruptions and caretaker duties, I could finally focus. My grades soared, and so did my confidence. My teachers noticed my eagerness, praising me for my hard work. Some of them confided that I had real potential for scholarships, and the thought excited me in a way I'd never experienced before. It was a future that belonged to me, a chance to carve out my path, to shape my destiny unburdened by the specter of guilt or obligation. Yet, every time I felt a wave of excitement, an undercurrent of worry followed. I couldn't help but reflect on how my sister was doing, whether my parents were coping without me, and whether they hated me for stepping away. The more success I tasted, the more I questioned if life was truly this simple, or if a new storm was gathering just beyond my sight. Nevertheless, my extended family was diligent in giving me updates. Some had tried visiting my sister, finding her conditions largely the same. My parents hovered over her constantly, but there was still no professional caregiver in sight. That news both relieved and troubled me. It confirmed they'd maintained the same misguided approach, but it also meant my sister was stuck in the same closed bubble with them, with no specialized support. My aunt quietly hinted that they were investigating legal options to ensure my sister got the care she needed, which might involve external agencies stepping in. The idea both comforted me and filled me with anxiety. Change was necessary, but any official intervention would undoubtedly anger my parents further. A swirl of rumors grew among the extended family. Some believed my parents might be in financial trouble, or even funneling money into vices we never suspected, while others speculated they were simply hoarding funds out of a warped sense of paranoia. The truth, as always, was murky, but the one certainty was that my parents clung to total control, both over my sister and the narrative they sold to anyone who would listen. As these rumors spread, I struggled with the guilt of not being there for my sister, but I reminded myself that staying in that house wouldn't have guaranteed her better care. It would have only guaranteed my own misery. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that bigger, more dramatic changes were on the horizon, changes that might force me to confront my parents again sooner than I imagined. Days slid into weeks, and weeks into months. As I slowly built a life at Grandpa's, my new school felt like a breath of fresh air. I even made friends who invited me out for study groups, coffee runs, and casual get-togethers on weekends. Each time I spent an afternoon with them, I was flooded by the realization of how isolated I'd been at my old school. Even though I did well academically, my focus had always been divided, overshadowed by calls to rush home or a sense of dread about potential crises. Now, I could laugh and talk about future plans, from summer internships to college dorm room ideas, without the usual cloud of guilt looming over my head. Grandpa noticed the shift in my demeanor. He'd catch me humming a tune while doing dishes or flipping through college brochures with a sparkle in my eyes, and I could see his relief. He later confided how powerless he had felt, watching from the sidelines all those years, not fully aware of how bad things were until I finally ran to him for help. He admitted that he wished he had intervened sooner, and though I told him it wasn't his fault, a part of me had wondered why no one in the family saw the signs earlier. But even in those moments of newfound happiness, echoes of the past persisted. My phone would occasionally light up with messages from unknown numbers, neighbors or acquaintances who had taken my parents' side, or old classmates wanting to know the juicy details. The drama continued, whether I liked it or not, and I knew that one day I'd have to face it head-on rather than bury my head in the sand. One afternoon, as I was considering scholarships for out-of-state universities, Grandpa approached me with a worried expression. He had just gotten off the phone with one of my uncles, who explained that my parents were threatening to sue for custody if I was still a minor. The legal concept was murky. I was just shy of turning 18, but they believed they could force me home, claiming I was in an unsafe environment. The irony made my stomach churn. Of all places, Grandpa's house was the safest environment I had ever known. Thankfully, my uncle assured Grandpa that my parents had a weak case. There was no evidence of neglect or abuse on Grandpa's side. Moreover, I was just months away from adulthood, meaning any legal entanglement would likely dissolve as soon as I turned 18. Still, the threat itself was emotionally jarring. It symbolized how far my parents were willing to go to maintain control. They would rather go to court than admit their wrongdoing or compromise. The tension that had been simmering was about to reach a boiling point. At that moment, a swirl of conflicting emotions rose in me. Relief that their lawsuit would probably fail, fear that they were escalating the situation, and anger that they believed they could yank me back into the life I had fought so hard to escape. I realized with growing clarity, sometimes you have to stand your ground, even if it means opposing the very people who brought you into this world. I told Grandpa I was willing to provide any statement or evidence needed to prove I was living safely and securely under his roof. We compiled letters from my new school, noting my attendance and good performance. My aunt and uncle also wrote supportive statements, emphasizing that I was happier and healthier since moving in with Grandpa. We even snapped pictures of my living conditions to show there was nothing amiss. By the time we finished, I felt both drained and strangely empowered. If my parents wanted to fight, I was no longer the timid child they could bully into silence. As these events played out, I also found myself reflecting more deeply on my sister. That childlike figure in my memory, gently rocking back and forth in front of the television, tapping wooden blocks in her own little world. I did love her. The resentment I once felt toward her was a redirection of the anger I should have felt at my parents. In some ways, I was mourning the bond we could have had if we'd grown up under different circumstances. I promised myself that one day, if it ever became healthy and safe, I would reconnect with her and try to build a real sibling relationship, one free from the blame our parents had sown. Little did I know that resolve would be tested sooner than I expected. With custody threats hanging in the air and the possibility of official involvement looming, everything was hurtling toward a dramatic climax that would reveal the true nature of our family's bonds, or lack thereof. 2 weeks before my 18th birthday, a letter arrived from a law firm representing my parents. It demanded my immediate return, stating that I was being held by extended family against my will. It was laughable. Nobody who saw me happily attending school and living in a stable environment could believe I was being held captive. But the letter served its intended purpose of intimidation. My hand shook as I read it, anger and disbelief coursing through me. Grandpa contacted an attorney friend, who reassured us that the case was absurd. Nevertheless, to ensure no misunderstandings, we decided I would write a formal statement attesting that I was living with Grandpa of my own free will. My relatives supported me wholeheartedly, offering to provide their own affidavits or testify if needed. It was surreal, the notion that I might have to stand in court and speak against my parents, especially considering all I really wanted was to be left in peace and offered a chance at a normal life. But in every trial, there can be a moment of revelation, a juncture where light pierces the darkness, and you see people's true colors. The legal threats my parents hurled at me only served to strengthen my determination. I was going to fight for my freedom no matter what it cost. And if they forced me to raise my voice, I would reveal every heartbreaking secret they'd tried to bury. News of the legal letter spread through the family grapevine. People were stunned, though some admitted they weren't entirely surprised. After all, my parents had a track record of controlling behavior, especially when it came to my sister's care. My aunts and uncles discussed how they could intervene more directly, perhaps by collectively urging my parents to see a family therapist or get professional help for my sister before it was too late. But if they had refused help for all these years, would anything change now? Amid these discussions, a gentle wave of solidarity washed over me. Cousins I hadn't spoken to in ages sent me supportive messages, letting me know they believed in my right to autonomy. One cousin revealed that she had even sensed something was off years ago, but she was too young to grasp the magnitude. It felt surreal to have all these people in my corner when, for so long, I'd thought no one noticed or cared. Their moral support fortified my spine, bolstering my resolve to stand firm. Yet, each new show of support also stoked the embers of bitterness toward my parents. They had twisted the narrative, demanding I return home under the guise of concern, when truly, they were battling to maintain a control that should never have been theirs. The tension was excruciating, but something inside me knew that the final act was still yet to unfold, an act that would either break me or set me free once and for all. A week before my birthday, my father unexpectedly called Grandpa's landline. With Grandpa sitting beside me, I reluctantly picked up. My father's tone was measured, almost too calm, as he claimed he just wanted to talk. He suggested I come over to the house. My old basement room was still there. He spoke of my sister missing me, how she would repeatedly wander into what used to be my bedroom, as if searching for me. It was a tactic I recognized instantly. Emotional manipulation, using my concern for my sister to lure me back. I told him I would only speak with him if we did so in a neutral location, and with Grandpa and our attorney friend present. He paused, clearly not expecting such a firm boundary. Then he tried a guilt trip, telling me how my mother had been crying nightly, and that my sister was becoming more anxious. I might have faltered before, overwhelmed by guilt, but at this point, I was emotionally steeled. I calmly repeated that if he wanted to have a real conversation, it needed to be on my terms. He muttered something about me being ungrateful, then abruptly ended the call. Hanging up the phone, I felt a trembling mixture of grief and relief. I realized I was mourning the last traces of what could have been a caring parental relationship. Yet, every step I took away from their manipulations proved I was healing. The final confrontation was inching ever closer, and I was determined not to face it alone or on their battlefield. Sure enough, 2 days later, my parents agreed to meet in a small conference room at our attorney friend's office. It was an odd setting for what was essentially a family discussion, but it felt necessary to have a space where emotions couldn't spiral out of control without consequence. Grandpa, my uncle, and I arrived first, taking seats around a rectangular wooden table. I stared at the muted beige walls, trying to steady my breathing, aware that each slow inhale brought me closer to a conversation that could redefine my relationship with my parents forever. When they arrived, they looked tense, shoulders stiff, expressions guarded. There were no friendly greetings, no attempt at small talk. My father clenched his jaw, and my mother clutched her purse, her eyes red-rimmed. They sat across from us, and for a moment, silence dominated the room. Then the attorney friend calmly began, explaining that this meeting was a voluntary attempt to resolve matters without further legal entanglements. He asked if anyone had anything to say. My parents exchanged a glance, and finally, my mother spoke, voice trembling as she insisted they never intended to cause me harm. My heart panged with conflicting emotions. I wanted to believe her, to cling to the notion that maybe, just maybe, they were sincere. But the question remained. If they truly never intended harm, why did they persist with manipulative tactics and lifelong caretaker expectations? I braced myself, ready for the conversation that would determine whether any bridge remained unburned. My mother tried to rationalize their actions. She painted a picture of exhaustion, of countless nights spent awake, worried about my sister's next meltdown or therapy appointment. She claimed they had no idea how to handle the financial burdens, so when relatives offered money, they used it as needed, sometimes stretching the truth about hiring caregivers. She spoke of feeling isolated and judged, of fearing condemnation if they admitted they were overwhelmed. For a fleeting moment, I saw a glimmer of vulnerability in her eyes, and part of me longed to comfort her. But then she circled back to her main point, that they had expected me, as the older sibling, to step up. I took a breath, voice quivering, as I explained how stepping up had led me to completely vanish as a person. I described living in the basement, having my personal belongings destroyed, missing out on normal teenage life, watching my own achievements go unnoticed, and being forced into a caretaker role I never volunteered for. I tried to express that while I understood my sister needed help, it wasn't fair or humane to demand I sacrifice my entire existence. When I finished, tears stung my eyes, and I fought to maintain composure. One might expect parental remorse at this point, perhaps an epiphany or a tearful apology. But as I would soon learn, sometimes love is buried too deep beneath resentment and pride. My father's reaction was as cold as ever, affirming my suspicion that no confession of pain would sway him from the path he'd chosen. He maintained that I was blowing things out of proportion, alleging that all families have burdens and that it was my duty to share in theirs. I felt my fists tighten, nails digging into my palms, as he effectively dismissed years of heartache and neglect in one fell swoop. Grandpa intervened, raising his voice to remind my father that obligations cut both ways. Parents are duty-bound to ensure their children feel supported and valued, not used. The tension in the room became palpable. My mother looked torn, as though she wanted to side with me but was too entrenched in the patterns they'd cultivated. After more back and forth, the attorney gently proposed that if my parents truly had my best interests at heart, they would allow me to remain with Grandpa until I turned 18 and then pursue higher education wherever I chose. He suggested that, in the meantime, they focus on securing legitimate professional help for my sister. It was a reasonable compromise, one that would address my sister's needs while respecting my autonomy. For a moment, hope fluttered in my chest. Yet, that hope was short-lived. My father's eyes hardened, and I sensed the storm building once more. In a tone devoid of warmth, he dismissed the suggestion outright. His final stance landed like a punch to the gut. If I refused to come home, then I was effectively disowning myself. And with that, the last thread of compromise snapped. A stunned silence fell over the room. The attorney quietly asked if my parents understood the implications of their words. Did they truly want to sever the familial relationship? My father said nothing, but the steely determination in his face spoke volumes. My mother glanced at me, tears filling her eyes, and in a voice choked with emotion she whispered, "We can't do this without you." I wanted to feel sympathy, but instead, I felt numb. It was as though I was watching the final scenes of a tragic play. where the characters are too blinded by their own illusions to see the path to redemption laid right before them. Grandpa rose, placing a hand on my shoulder, signaling that we should leave. My attorney friend nodded, acknowledging the meeting was effectively over. I stood, meeting my parents' gaze. A swirl of heartbreak, disappointment, and a tiny fraction of pity swelled in me. I didn't utter a dramatic goodbye or hurl accusations. I simply said, "I hope one day you realize what you've done." Then I walked out, every step echoing the resolution that I wouldn't let them define my life any longer. That final walk out the door felt like the culmination of 100 heartbreaks. In the hallway, as my uncle and grandpa escorted me to the elevator, I felt tears slip down my cheeks. But beneath the sadness, something else took root, an unshakable conviction that I was doing what I had to do. Because sometimes saving yourself is the only way forward, even if it means leaving behind those who should have loved you unconditionally. The days that followed were a haze of emotional recovery. I barely slept, replaying every detail of that final encounter. The weight of my father's ultimatum, "Come home or be disowned," pressed on my chest like a physical force. But strangely, as each morning arrived, the burden felt a little lighter. With Grandpa's unwavering support and the continuous outpouring of concern from relatives, I realized I wasn't alone. While it wasn't the ideal family I had once imagined, it was enough to help me stand on my own 2 feet. I dove into schoolwork to distract myself, channeling my anguish into productivity. The heartbreak spurred me to apply to multiple colleges with a new fervor. I wrote deeply personal admissions essays, not detailing every painful secret, but weaving in the resilience and empathy I'd developed through adversity. Friends cheered me on, and some even insisted on reading my drafts, offering feedback that gave me a renewed sense of purpose. "Keep going," they said. "You deserve a life you can call your own." Those words echoed in my mind, reinforcing the realization that I was no longer the powerless child my parents had molded me to be. Yet the question still lingered. How would my 18th birthday unfold, and what future awaited me once I stepped fully into adulthood? As the date approached, I braced for one last wave of turbulence, uncertain whether my parents would attempt another desperate maneuver or quietly fade from my life for good. When my birthday finally arrived, Grandpa organized a modest celebration. It was nothing extravagant, just a small gathering with my closest relatives, a homemade cake, and some cheerful decorations. The day carried an emotional undertone, as if everyone was aware of the significance. Turning 18 meant I was legally out of my parents' reach, free to make my own decisions, and no longer subject to the threat of being forced home. My phone remained suspiciously silent. By evening, I realized my parents hadn't even called or texted to wish me a happy birthday. I wasn't surprised, but it still stung. At the gathering, my aunt handed me a small envelope. Inside was a check, the amount sizable enough to pay for tuition at a decent community college if I chose. She explained that this was the money she'd been giving my parents for my sister's caregiver, money they'd never spent on actual care. She wanted it to go to me now, to support my educational journey. Tears pooled in my eyes as I thanked her. It felt like more than a financial gift. It was a tangible symbol that someone in my family believed in my potential, unburdened by the caretaker role I had been shoved into. It was a moment of both relief and heartache. Relief because I finally saw a future that might include the college of my dreams, and heartache because I wished my parents could have been part of that future. As I blew out the candles, I couldn't help but wonder. Was it possible to celebrate a new chapter while simultaneously mourning the loss of the people who were supposed to stand beside me on this journey? In the weeks that followed, I received acceptance letters from several colleges. One in particular stood out. A university in another state with an impressive program in social work and psychology. Ironically, my experiences caring for my sister had sparked an interest in understanding the complexities of developmental disorders and family dynamics. A part of me wanted to channel my pain into something constructive, perhaps helping other families navigate challenges more ethically and lovingly than my own parents had. I took the acceptance letter to Grandpa with a tearful smile, and he hugged me, beaming with pride. Meanwhile, true to their word, my parents continued to shut me out. They made no attempt to reconcile or attend any family gatherings, though occasionally I'd hear from relatives that they were complaining about me. They insisted I'd turn my back on my sister, painting themselves as the victims of my rebellion. At first, these stories cut deep, but eventually, I realized they were struggling to justify their actions to themselves. Their stubborn narrative was a reflection of their refusal to accept any responsibility. Sometimes, the knowledge that you've done everything in your power to make things right is the only solace you can find. I no longer tried to chase their approval. Instead, I focused on building a future I could be proud of. But there was one last emotional hurdle: actually leaving the state, crossing that invisible line that felt like the final goodbye to my old life. As my departure date neared, Grandpa offered to drive me to the campus. It would be a road trip spanning several days, an opportunity for us to share more stories and prepare for our inevitable goodbye. My uncle and aunt planned a small send-off, complete with a homemade dinner and heartfelt toasts. They reminded me I always had a home with them if I needed it. Each farewell was bittersweet, carrying echoes of the family we once were, and the family we had become. I packed my belongings, carefully tucking away cherished mementos from the happier times of my childhood, as well as the lessons learned from the painful times. My sister's well-being still weighed heavily on my mind, but I knew I couldn't do anything unless my parents allowed outside help or changed their approach. My relatives were monitoring the situation, with one aunt taking the lead in contacting agencies about special needs resources. That was all we could do for now. Standing in my bedroom at Grandpa's, surrounded by half-filled boxes and the faint smell of old books, I felt a swirl of anticipation and sadness. This was a juncture that simultaneously filled me with a sense of loss and a surge of hope. The final journey away from my hometown was about to begin, and with it, I was leaving behind the ghosts of the basement, the broken MacBook, and the missed school speech. On the morning of our departure, Grandpa and I loaded my boxes into his old pickup truck. My aunt handed me a thermos of coffee, and my uncle gave me a new laptop as a parting gift, a symbolic replacement for the one that had been destroyed so long ago. Emotions bubbled at the surface, and I fought to keep myself composed. This was it, the culmination of months of planning, heartbreak, and determination. We pulled out of the driveway, waving at tearful faces in the rear-view mirror, my chest tight with a mixture of excitement and nostalgia. The drive was peaceful, marked by long stretches of highway and open sky. Grandpa shared stories of road trips he had taken in his youth, times when he felt invincible, chasing dreams he barely remembered now. He encouraged me to embrace every moment of this new chapter, to be unafraid of forging a path that was mine alone. We talked about everything: my hopes for college, my fear of failing, my unspoken guilt over leaving my sister behind. He reassured me that I wasn't abandoning her, but rather freeing myself from a trap that wasn't my responsibility. Yet, even as the miles melted away behind us, I sensed one final wave of conflict might still be waiting. Deep down, I suspected my parents wouldn't let me leave state lines without at least one last display of resistance. And, sure enough, near the halfway point, my phone buzzed with an unknown number, igniting a flicker of dread in my belly. I answered hesitantly, my heart thumping, bracing for more accusations. It was my mother. She spoke in a quiet, almost hollow voice, asking if I could please come back. She said my sister hadn't been sleeping well, as though my presence was the only remedy for her restlessness. A flood of memories swirled: my sister's laughter, her destructive episodes, the times I'd comforted her, and the countless moments my parents berated me for trying to carve out my own space. I explained calmly that I was already on the road, heading to college, and that I couldn't abandon my education. She started sobbing, making half-formed pleas about how she and my father had tried everything, yet nothing worked like me being there. It was manipulative, but I also heard genuine despair in her voice, a grief-laden acceptance that maybe they'd gone too far. My chest constricted. Despite all the damage they'd done, she was still my mother. But every second of that phone call reminded me why I had left in the first place. If there had been a chance to salvage our relationship, it might have been this conversation. Yet, as her sobs turned into pleas for me to come home and resume my role, I understood nothing had really changed. They still didn't see me as a person with a right to a life of my own. I gave her a gentle goodbye, wishing her peace, but not offering any promise of returning. Then, with trembling hands, I ended the call. Grandpa glanced at me from the driver's seat, worry etched into the lines of his face. I forced a small smile, assuring him I was okay. We continued on, but the air was thicker now, laden with the weight of my mother's final entreaty. My thoughts churned, flipping between guilt and resolve. I knew I was making the right choice for my own future, but part of me still mourned the possibility of having parents who supported my growth rather than stifled it. At the next pit stop, Grandpa pulled into a rest area flanked by towering pine trees. We sat at a picnic table in the shade, sipping cold water. Without prompting, he reached into his coat pocket and handed me a folded letter. It was from him, written before our trip, in case he couldn't find the right words to say during the drive. Carefully, I unfolded it, tears pricking my eyes as I read. He praised my courage, reminding me that a life lived under duress is no life at all. The letter ended with a line that tugged at my heart. Sometimes we must leave behind those we love to love ourselves enough. His words resonated like a balm over a fresh wound, a reminder that the hardest choices can be acts of self-preservation rather than selfishness. I tucked the letter away, inhaling the scent of pine and listening to the faint hum of passing cars. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in forever, uncertainty felt like an invitation to grow, rather than a sentence to confinement. When we finally arrived at the university dorms, I was greeted by clusters of students unloading boxes, hugging their families, and nervously laughing about orientation. It struck me how normal it all seemed, a rite of passage I'd almost missed because of obligations I never asked for. Grandpa helped me carry my belongings up the creaking elevator to my new room, a modest space with 2 beds, 2 desks, and cinder-block walls. My roommate hadn't arrived yet, so I laid out my comforter and placed my few personal decorations on the desk, the feeling surreal. Grandpa and I then walked around campus, exploring the library, the student center, and a small cafe. Buildings towered over us, brimming with the potential for new beginnings. I caught snippets of conversation from other incoming freshmen, talk of majors, excitement about events, casual jokes about cafeteria food. It felt like a parallel universe to the life I'd led just months ago, where every hour was overshadowed by the next crisis at home. Now, I was stepping into a world where I could discover who I was beyond caretaker or overshadowed child. Yet, in the back of my mind, I still braced for a final blow. My parents could appear unannounced, or I might receive some dire text urging me to rush home. Even as I tried to savor my first taste of independence, the ghost of my old responsibilities lingered, reminding me that some scars never fully fade. Eventually, the sun dipped low, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. We returned to my dorm, and Grandpa lingered by the door, his eyes brimming with pride and a hint of sadness. We stood there, unsure of how to say goodbye. This man had become my sanctuary, offering me a lifeline I never knew I needed. He finally spoke, voice thick with emotion. "Promise me you'll take care of yourself." I nodded, unable to form words. We hugged, and I felt his warmth, a fatherly comfort I wished I'd received from my own dad. After he left, I sat on my bed, letting the hum of the hallway fill the silence. Through the small window, I watched other parents driving away, some with tears in their eyes, others with beaming smiles, all letting their children step forward into adulthood. I couldn't help but compare it to my own departure. No tearful, supportive goodbye from Mom and Dad, just a phone call overshadowed by guilt and regret. But I refused to let that define my collegiate experience. I'd come too far to let their absence overshadow my new beginning. That first night in the dorm, I barely slept. My mind buzzed with 1,000 questions. Would I excel here? Would I make friends? Would my parents keep trying to reel me back in? Would my sister be okay without me? Eventually, as the dark hours wore on, a quiet acceptance washed over me. The answers weren't clear, but I was here, living my own life, one step closer to healing. And sometimes, that first step into the unknown is the bravest act of all. Orientation week was a whirlwind of new faces, scheduled activities, and campus tours. I attended icebreakers, where I awkwardly introduced myself, discovering a sense of liberation in telling my story however I chose. No one stared at me with pity or preconceived notions about my sister's condition. I made a couple of fast friends, bonding over our shared nerves about the year ahead. I also visited the psychology department, discussing my interest in courses related to developmental disorders and family counseling. The professors were warm and inviting, already stoking my curiosity for the field. All the while, messages from extended family trickled in, offering encouragement. My aunt texted almost daily, reminding me to have fun and even sending silly memes to brighten my day. My uncle checked in about finances, ensuring my tuition and housing were squared away. Grandpa called every few evenings, not to pry, but to listen to my stories about dorm life with genuine delight. In a strange twist, I had lost the two people meant to raise me, my parents, but gained an entire network of relatives who championed my independence. Yet, a persistent unease still followed me. I had come so far, but I couldn't shake the feeling that my parents weren't done with me. When I least expected it, a phone call or email might emerge, threatening to unravel the safe space I was creating for myself. The question was whether their words could still reach me, or if I'd learned to build a fortress around my peace. My worry wasn't unfounded. One evening, after finishing dinner in the campus cafeteria, I returned to my dorm to find an envelope slipped under my door. Inside was a handwritten letter, no return address. My chest tightened when I recognized my mother's handwriting. It was a short message. "We're sorry for how things have gone. Please come home. Your sister needs you." Enclosed was a photograph of my sister, gazing blankly at the camera, holding a stuffed animal I recognized from years ago. I sat on the edge of my bed, heart racing, reading the letter over and over. Part of me yearned to believe it was an olive branch, a sign they might finally value me for who I was. But the letter contained no genuine acknowledgement of my pain, no recognition of the wrongs they'd committed. It was just another plea, hinged on my sister's dependency and my mother's fragile state. I closed my eyes, recalling the conversation with my father, the caretaker lies, the ultimatum to come home or be disowned. The letter tasted like manipulation disguised as an apology. I didn't know what they expected. That I'd pack up my dorm room, abandon my studies, and return to the same basement I'd fought so hard to escape? If this was their version of an apology, it fell heartbreakingly short. I slipped the letter back into the envelope, resolving not to respond. My future was here, in these corridors, not there under their roof of impossible expectations. As the semester progressed, I threw myself into my classes. I joined a volunteer program where we worked with special needs children at a community center. The hands-on experience was both enlightening and emotionally challenging. Seeing children with a range of conditions, some more severe than my sister's, made me reflect on how different her life could have been had my parents accepted actual professional help. Over time, I built a supportive rapport with the staff there, some of whom had backgrounds similar to mine. Siblings with special needs, complicated family dynamics, and the desire to make a difference. The more immersed I became in these activities, the more assured I felt that I was on the right path, forging a future built on empathy but not entrapment. My advisor encouraged me to consider dual majors in psychology and social work, pointing out how my personal story could inform a powerful career helping families navigate special needs care. This idea both excited and terrified me. Could I really turn my past trauma into a tool for change? Part of me worried I was too close to the subject, still wounded from the scars of my own upbringing. However, every new step forward validated that I was exactly where I needed to be. The guilt, the sorrow, the resentment, they were all real, but so was my determination to grow beyond them. And as I found my footing, I began to realize that my parents' hold on me was waning. They could send letters, they could make phone calls, but I was no longer that scared child trapped in the basement. I was evolving into someone stronger, someone ready to help not just herself, but possibly others in similar situations. At Thanksgiving, Grandpa visited me on campus. My parents, predictably, didn't reach out. Grandpa and I shared a quiet meal in a local restaurant near the university. We talked about everything: my classes, his health, and the extended family's continued efforts to encourage my parents to change their ways. He admitted my sister was still living in what seemed like an emotionally stifling environment, with no real professional support system. My parents remained defensive, turning down every offer from the rest of the family. It was sobering news, a reminder that while I had managed to escape, my sister hadn't. Yet, in the same breath, Grandpa assured me that the extended family wasn't giving up. They were looking into local programs, hoping to convince my parents or at least get some agency involved. He gently reminded me that taking on that battle alone wouldn't be healthy. It was a collective effort now, and they didn't blame me for not going back. I felt an odd mixture of gratitude and sorrow, unsure if I would ever reconcile my love for my sister with my need for self-preservation. As we finished our meal, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. Perhaps one day, after finishing my education and establishing my own life, I could approach my sister's situation from a position of strength. But for now, I needed to remain steadfast on my own journey. The question was, how much more heartbreak would unfold before my parents admitted they needed help, or before my sister was old enough to express her needs herself? December rolled around, and with it came finals. I spent countless hours in the library, poring over textbooks, scribbling notes, and forming study groups with my classmates. Sleep became a luxury, overshadowed by last-minute projects and exam prep. Interestingly, the stress of college seemed more manageable than the emotional stress of home life I had once shouldered. Whenever I felt overwhelmed, I reminded myself of how far I'd come, the battles I'd fought to get here, and how these academic challenges were stepping stones to a better future. On a chilly evening after my last exam, I walked across campus, gazing at the holiday lights strung up around the quad. The air smelled of pine and roasted chestnuts from a nearby vendor. Students bustled about in festive sweaters, exchanging gifts and hugging each other goodbye before winter break. I paused by a decorated tree, letting myself feel a moment of quiet reflection. The atmosphere was radiant and alive, a stark contrast to the hollow tension that once greeted me whenever I stepped into my parents' house. Standing there, I realized the significance of my transformation. Less than a year ago, I was locked in a basement, overshadowed by a burden I never volunteered for. Now, I was creating holiday memories in a place that welcomed me with open arms. But the season of family gatherings brought a question to my mind. Would my parents attempt any last-ditch effort to pull me back? Or was our silent standoff destined to remain? When winter break arrived, most students packed up to visit their families. I had a decision to make: stay on campus or go home with Grandpa. Home, in this sense, was still Grandpa's house, not my parents'. After a moment's hesitation, I chose to return with Grandpa for the holidays. My roommate was leaving, and the dorms were officially closing for break, so staying on campus wasn't really an option. The thought of crossing into the same town as my parents made me uneasy, but I felt reassured by Grandpa's presence. He picked me up on a cold afternoon, the sun setting early behind thick clouds. The drive was quieter than our journey to college. We'd both grown accustomed to each other's company, and words weren't always necessary. Upon arriving at Grandpa's house, I felt a wave of nostalgia. Everything looked the same: the cozy living room, the small kitchen table where we'd shared so many candid talks, and my old makeshift bedroom. I dropped my bag in the corner, exhaling a breath that carried the weight of 1,000 memories. Yet, as comforting as Grandpa's house was, it still lay in the shadow of my parents' home. They were just a few miles away, and I couldn't predict what would happen next. My mind spun with possibilities: an unexpected visit, a sudden confrontation, or maybe a forced conversation about my sister. The tension was a slow burn, inching toward an inevitable spark. Sure enough, 2 days before Christmas, my father showed up at Grandpa's doorstep unannounced. I was sitting in the living room, flipping through a book, when I heard a sharp knock at the door. Grandpa answered, and I caught the deep rumble of my father's voice. My stomach clenched. Unsure if I was ready, I remained seated until Grandpa beckoned me over. There in the doorway stood my father, face lined with stress, eyes flicking between me and the floor. His opening words were blunt. "Your sister's not doing well. She won't eat, and the doctors say she's depressed. She keeps asking for you." My throat tightened. I wasn't naive. I suspected an ulterior motive beyond genuine concern. But hearing that my sister's health was deteriorating still jolted me. I asked if they had finally sought professional help for her, maybe a specialized counselor or therapy. He dodged the question, mumbling about how it was complicated. Then he asked me to come back, at least for Christmas. My entire being tensed. This was the moment I'd feared. The desperate holiday plea. The attempt to guilt me into returning under the guise of my sister's well-being. I glanced at Grandpa, who gave me a look that said he'd stand by me, whatever I decided. But in my heart, I knew I couldn't go back to a role that had caused me so much harm, even if the request came cloaked in a crisis. I swallowed hard, keeping my voice measured as I told my father I was sorry my sister was struggling, but I couldn't step back into that house without concrete assurances of professional help and a clear indication that I wouldn't be relegated to caretaker status. I mentioned the local services my aunt had investigated, naming a couple of programs that specialized in autism therapy. My father's expression darkened. He insisted those were too expensive, and that I was the only one who truly knew how to handle my sister. I felt a wave of anger rise in me, recalling all the times they had dismissed my needs while claiming I was indispensable to my sister's survival. Another wave of guilt crashed right after. This was my sister we were talking about, a girl who couldn't fully articulate her own struggles. It was a vicious tug-of-war in my head, but I stood my ground, urging my father to consider the professional routes. The conversation grew increasingly tense, culminating in him muttering, "I hope you can live with yourself if something happens to her." Those words stung like a whip, a final attempt to manipulate me through fear. My father left soon after, shutting the door behind him with a force that shook the window panes. I felt tears burn the back of my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. For better or worse, that confrontation sealed it. I wasn't returning, not under these terms, not ever. The path I'd chosen was painful, but it was mine to walk. Christmas Day arrived in a haze of emotions. Grandpa did his best to keep the spirit alive. He decorated a small tree, strung up lights, even wrapped a few gifts. My aunt, uncle, and some cousins came over for a modest feast. Everyone tried to act merry, but the tension lurked beneath the surface. They all knew about my father's visit and the hurtful things he'd said. My cousins, bless them, tried to lighten the mood by playing Christmas music and challenging me to board games. It helped, if only for a few hours, to forget the heartbreak. Later that evening, I found myself alone in the living room, the tree's multicolored lights casting dancing shadows on the walls. A swirl of memory tugged at me, the rare moments during childhood when Christmas felt magical, before my sister's diagnosis consumed our household. I wondered if there could have been a different reality, one where we all pulled together with genuine love rather than compulsion, one where my parents recognized my needs even as they cared for my sister. Yet, daydreaming about what could have been often brings more sorrow than solace. The reality was that every moment of my journey had led me here, to a place where I could celebrate the holiday in relative peace, free from the crushing weight of caretaker duties. The price was the fracturing of my relationship with my parents, a cost that still pained me. But this year, I refused to let that overshadow my gratitude for the family who did stand by me. By New Year's Eve, I was preparing to return to campus, eager to throw myself back into academic life. Grandpa seemed reluctant to see me go, but he knew it was for the best. On the morning of my departure, we shared a quiet breakfast. Outside, snow drifted lazily to the ground, blanketing the neighborhood in a pristine white hush. Grandpa offered to drive me again, and I accepted, grateful for his company. Before we left, he handed me a small journal, wrapped in plain paper. Inside the front cover, he had written a simple phrase, "Write your own story." Those 4 words encapsulated everything he believed in for me, the freedom to shape my destiny without the constraints my parents had imposed. I clutched the journal to my chest, tears prickling my eyes as I thanked him. He smiled, the lines around his eyes crinkling with kindness, and I realized how blessed I was to have someone like him in my corner. Driving away from the house for the second time felt strangely less agonizing than the first. Perhaps I was growing accustomed to goodbyes, or perhaps I finally trusted in my own resilience. Either way, I glanced at the snow-laden rooftops of my old neighborhood as we merged onto the highway, silently bidding farewell to the girl I once was, the one who believed she had no choice but to carry everyone else's burdens. We made it back to campus safely, the landscape shifting from snowbanks to steel skyscrapers as we approached the city outskirts near the university. Grandpa helped me unload my bags into the dorm lobby, hugging me tightly before departing. I watched his truck disappear into the distance, already missing his reassuring presence. Yet, a new kind of calm settled over me when I re-entered my room. Classes would start soon, and I had a fresh schedule brimming with psychology, social work, and a dash of creative writing to feed my soul. That evening, as I reorganized my desk, I found the small journal Grandpa had given me. Flipping through the blank pages, I felt a surge of inspiration. In a swift motion, I grabbed a pen and began writing the very first line. I am not defined by the burdens thrust upon me. I define myself. The words spilled out, detailing the fragments of my journey. My sister's birth, the basement, the caretaker role, the MacBook fiasco, the confrontation over college, and the final escape. I wrote and wrote, tears sometimes smudging the ink, but it felt liberating, as though each sentence granted me permission to heal. Little did I know that this simple act of journaling would become a cornerstone of my emotional recovery. Within these pages, I would craft my own narrative, free from the manipulations and secrets that once dictated my life. Each new sentence was a declaration of independence, and I had only just begun. Time slipped into a comforting routine. Lectures, study groups, library research, and my volunteer work at the community center. My social circle expanded. I found friends who understood the complexities of my background, as well as those who simply accepted me as I was, a somewhat guarded but determined freshman. In late January, I received a piece of news that made my stomach flutter with excitement. I had earned a small scholarship from the psychology department, enough to cover some of my textbooks and fees. It felt like a nod from the universe that I was on the right path. Yet, even as I flourished academically, the ghost of my past life lingered. Each time I checked my phone, I half expected to see a barrage of missed calls or texts from my parents. They'd gone silent since Christmas, but the memory of my father's final words haunted me. I hope you can live with yourself if something happens to her. Occasionally, that line would echo in my head at night, making me wonder if my sister was truly okay. But fear and guilt no longer paralyzed me as they once did. Instead, they spurred me to keep moving forward, to prove that my life had value outside of their narrow definition. Every milestone I reached, every new friendship I forged, was another testament to the fact that I could and would live with myself, regardless of their dire insinuations. The horizon of my future stretched open, brimming with possibilities I was only beginning to imagine. As spring approached, the campus awakened from winter's slumber. Students lounged on grassy lawns, discussing everything from politics to personal dreams. I joined a study group for my developmental psychology class, where we delved into case studies about children with various special needs. The irony of my own lived experience shaped my contributions to group discussions. I found myself more empathetic than ever, yet also determined to highlight the necessity of proper professional involvement. My classmates listened with wide eyes as I recounted generic versions of my own struggles. In those moments, I felt an odd mixture of pride and sorrow. Proud that I had something meaningful to share. Sorrowful that it came from a place of deep pain. Not long after, my volunteer supervisor approached me with an opportunity to become a peer mentor for new volunteers. She said my maturity and insight could be invaluable in guiding others. I hesitated, uncertain if I was ready to assume any form of leadership after spending so much of my life subjugated to someone else's needs. But her words stuck with me, and I eventually accepted. The chance to lead in a healthy, balanced setting, free from manipulation, felt like another step forward in reclaiming the narrative of my life. Still, a small voice in my mind whispered, "What if your parents see this as hypocrisy?" They'd likely twist it, saying I was willing to help strangers but not my own sister. But that voice was steadily losing power. I reminded myself that volunteering was my choice, undertaken with free will and healthy boundaries, a stark contrast to the coerced caretaker role I escaped. Days turned into weeks, and soon final exams for the second semester loomed on the horizon. I found solace in the library and late-night study sessions fueled by coffee and quiet camaraderie. One particularly exhausting evening, I opened my phone to see a new message from a number I recognized as one of my mother's friends. Curiosity piqued. I clicked to read it, bracing for possible drama. Instead, the text said that my sister was showing more frequent signs of distress and that my parents still refused outside help. The friend, clearly distraught, hinted that something had happened, an incident that involved my sister almost hurting herself, but she didn't provide details. My chest tightened as the horrifying thought flashed. Had my parents' negligence reached a critical point? My hands shook as I read. Was it a ploy to drag me back, or was it a genuine cry for help? Either way, I couldn't ignore the dread creeping into every cell of my body. If there was any truth to this, my sister might be in real danger. I faced a devastating choice: maintain my distance to protect myself, or risk re-entering the lion's den for her sake. After a sleepless night, I decided to call that friend directly. She revealed fragments of a story involving my sister becoming so agitated that she nearly harmed herself in a meltdown. My parents were frantic, yet still insisted they could handle it alone, refusing the specialized interventions that had been suggested countless times. My heart ached for my sister, but I also recalled the many nights I spent locked in the basement, unheard and unsupported. I wrestled with a massive surge of responsibility, overshadowed by the knowledge of how easily my parents could trap me again if I stepped too close. In the end, I resolved to contact the appropriate local agency. My aunt collaborated with me, and we placed an anonymous tip, detailing that my sister might be in urgent need of professional supervision and therapy. We provided the addresses, the approximate severity of her condition, and the repeated refusals of help. It was the most we could do from a distance without sacrificing the stability I'd fought so hard to achieve. I cried after making the call, torn between sorrow and a strange, fierce relief that at least we were doing something. As painful as it was, that moment underscored how far I had come. From a powerless child to someone willing to use whatever resources available to protect my sister without surrendering my own autonomy. It didn't erase the guilt or the heartbreak, but it reminded me that loving someone doesn't mean allowing yourself to be destroyed in the process. In the weeks that followed, I received sporadic updates that a social worker was indeed attempting to intervene at my parents' home, though my parents were said to be uncooperative. Still, it was a flicker of hope, a testament that outside help might eventually break through. Meanwhile, I finished my finals with respectable grades, and as I packed up for a brief summer stay at Grandpa's, I reflected on the tumultuous year behind me. I had severed ties with my parents to protect myself, and found an entirely new support system in the process. My guilt over leaving my sister behind was tempered by the knowledge that she, too, deserved better care that my parents were finally being pressured to provide. Each day, I continued to define my own story, page by page, choice by choice. I didn't know if my parents would ever truly understand the damage they caused. I didn't know if my sister's condition would improve, or if she would one day ask me about my departure. But I did know one thing. Walking away had been necessary, and it had allowed me to become the person I was always meant to be. Perhaps someday, I'll muster the courage to rebuild some semblance of a relationship with my mother and father, but only if they meet me halfway, respecting my right to exist beyond the role they tried to force upon me. Until then, I'm learning what it means to love from a distance, to let go of anger so I can heal, and to forgive myself for what I once perceived as betrayal but now see as the ultimate act of self-preservation. Because the truth is, we can care for others more wholeheartedly once we've learned to care for ourselves. And no matter how daunting the journey, there's a profound strength in stepping out from the shadows, in declaring that your life matters too. That single realization that I am more than just a caretaker or a forgotten daughter has lit a path forward brighter than any basement lamp could ever hope to shine. And on that path, I continue to walk, one step after another, free at last.